Welcome back to the Goldmark Gallery for another of our Goldmark TV broadcasts. We've got a number of different things to show you today. First off, I've had my first quarantine self-haircut. But that's not the only self-editing that we'll be seeing today. We're going to have a look at these fantastic linocuts by Claude Flight and Edith Lawrence. Later we'll be looking at Ceri Richards' last great masterpiece, Journey Toward the North. And then a special little edition. We've had some beautiful Georges Braque acquatints that have come in literally just the last couple of days. I saw them for the first time this morning, so we're going to share that with you later. And we had hoped that we were going to be showing you some pots of the kitchen today. Some changes in weather have changed our plans for that film. So instead we're going to treat you to a very special viewing of Kang-hyo decorating one of his huge ongi pots. So don't miss that later. But first we're going to start with these fantastic little linocuts by Claude Flight and Edith Lawrence. Art historians tend to bemoan a lack of modernism and avant-gardism in British art in the 20th century. If we think back to those first 10 or 20 years, the sort of pre-war years of the early 1900s, you think of the Expressionism in Germany, Futurism in Italy, the Fauvism, Cubism, Surrealism that springs up in Paris. What did we have in England? Well, we had a single movement, Vorticism. A sort of mishmash of futurist ideas and polemic that was developed by Wyndham Lewis, one of the important figures in British art of the early 20th century. Really, Vorticism was an abortive movement. It sprung up just before the war and was quickly snuffed out as many of its main members were killed during the conflict. And Wyndham Lewis's attempts to sort of revive that movement after the war mostly failed. But in that little glimpse we saw in a sort of couple of years in Britain, the explosion of a kind of a new way of thinking about things. And in that single explosion, you can see the seeds of the work of Claude Flight, Edith Lawrence, and the Grosvenor School, which they helped found. Flight and Lawrence were of that sort of that coterie of artists that sort of grew out of those years just before the war, studying at a time when in British art, although there weren't these same natural growths of art movements, instead what you got was artists taking the ideas that they saw on the continent and applying them to the worlds of design, of sort of multidisciplinary sort of approaches. You think of Roger Fry's Bloomsbury Group, the Amiga Workshops, the Rebel Art Centre where Vorticism was first launched. And then after the war, people like Eric Revilius and Edward Borden, who really showed how modern art could be applied to the worlds of design, of illustration, of printmaking, of muraling, how art was something for the people and to be applied to all walks of life. Claude Flight and Edith Lawrence were both artists from that sort of era. Flight actually came to art quite late in his career. He started off his life trying out a number of different vocations. He trained as an engineer, he worked as a librarian, even a beekeeper at one point on a farm, before eventually coming to art in his early 30s. And it was in the years just before the war and then just after that he really started to develop a very individual style, individual voice. And in 1919 discovered the joys of linocut printing. As one of the very earliest sort of innovators in linocut, he found this material which was sort of very everyday. It was supposed to be sort of used for domestic kitchens, that sort of thing. Made of linseed oil and gummed together with resin. It made for a fantastically cheap and pliable material that could take a lot of abuse, but with which, because it has no sort of no resistance like wood, it has a no natural grain. You could affect the same kind of beautiful rotational sort of moving lines that you would get in those paintings and prints from the Vorticist movement. The world that Flight was looking at was really a world of movement, a world of rapid change, a world of business. He described it as a world where everyone seems to be in a hurry. Things like traffic, buses, people riding around on bikes and scooters, the sort of the hustle and bustle of urban life, but also of rural labour, of working on the farms and ploughshares, the emergence of tractors. All of that sort of feeds into the work that Claude Flight made. After the war, he discovered Edith Lawrence, who had herself been one of those students at the Slade in the years just before the war. One of many young women to emerge from the Slade, which was a much more sort of egalitarian art school at the time, compared to say the Royal Academy. They met together, and like so many artists, so many British artists who were sort of birthed from that early modernist explosion of the 1910s, they started up a design studio and they worked together in partnership. And it was then in 1925, with the help of printmakers Ian McNab, Sybil Andrews and Cyril Power, that this quartet established the Grosvenor School of Art. The Grosvenor School was to become a sort of bastion of printmaking, of collaborative work, of championing linocutting as this process which anybody could pick up, anybody could afford the materials. The prints would be cheap to print, people could afford them, they could be hung in homes. A way of bringing the sort of the vitality of modern art to a much broader public and a much broader range of artists too. Flight was probably the champion of the medium. He's really the artist of all in the 20th century, barring maybe Picasso, who did as much for linocutting as anybody else. It was really within this environment of collaboration, of sharing, of working together, working partnerships that you had these sort of couplings emerging. So you think of Sybil Andrews and Cyril Power, who put their surnames together and signed their work as Andrew Power. This was much the case with Claude Flight and Edith Lawrence. Although they weren't romantically involved, they worked together almost all their lives. And indeed, when Flight suffered from an illness late in his life, it was Edith Lawrence who nursed him through that. Their work is almost completely indiscernible from each other's in either their watercolours or in their fantastic lively linocuts. Now the prints I've got in front of me are a sort of maybe a far cry from those sort of very violent, vibrant scenes of the modern city of the 20th century. These are much more witty. This is from a suite called Christmas and Other Feasts and Festivals. And it was intended as a series of images that were, I think as Flight described it, a picture commentary for grown-ups. It's a humorous take on how food, season, festival, ritual has really been with us right from the start. And there's a number of very funny takes on how the sort of the communal act of eating and drinking together has been shared over the years, from prehistoric dwellers fighting over a whale carcass, through to maybe these Anglo-Saxons talking about their next raid over a meal, right up to the modern day with maybe this Parisian cafe scene, or this fantastic little set of nursery children creating havoc around this table. Now, for all their fun and all their whimsy, you can see in these prints the blueprint of that sort of that vorticist style, that sense of movement, of curve, of line being all important. There's a sort of tremendous zip to these little sort of domestic leisurely scenes, even though what they're showing is sort of quite a sort of a laid back sort of repose. You get this fantastic line in this series of children, their arms outstretched waiting for their helping of plum pudding. Sort of typical, essential, quintessential British meal there. Or in these troops outside Buckingham Palace, this fantastic sort of replication of lines, this sense of movement across the print. Even in these little these little scenes of fun and of wit, sort of carefreeness, you can see those sort of modernist tenets of movement and dynamism being played out. Flight thought that education was hugely important to the world of art. He published a number of books on lino cutting, of which I have one here. These sort of explain the processes that he goes through in designing, in cutting, the sort of the trials and errors that he's made over the years, and sort of made it their own. I think this is a really delightful series of prints. They really sort of capture the sense of lino cut, both as a very sort of easy medium, an easy way of bringing people into the world of art, into the world of thinking about images and image making and how compositions are sort of structured and the movement of lines through them, but also just scenes of real sort of comedy and enjoyment and joy. There's no cynicism to them. There's no sort of no violence, no sort of abruptness. There's none of the sort of braggadocio that you got with vorticist movement or with the futurists. There's a sort of pure enjoyment in colour and line and form, and that's why I think they've endured over the years and become really sort of celebrated images in British art. Journey Toward the North, which is this print portfolio I have here in front of me, was the last work that Ceri Richards ever produced. And I've got here in front of me a number of beautiful preparatory paintings and sketches that Ceri Richards made for the making of these prints. Richards is an interesting British artist, a Welsh artist, who has really gone undervalued, unremembered properly by much of the art establishment. He was a major art figure who explored the transformations, the metamorphosis of music and art and poetry. Started off as a sort of an early surrealist, but really blossomed as an explorer of the hidden meanings in British poetry, in music and in landscape. Now we're going to have a look at some of these sketches, these paintings and the print portfolio in a minute, but first I'd like to leave you with Mel Gooding, a fabulous art historian who knew Ceri Richards personally and is going to illuminate some of these beautiful works for us just now.
These drawings by Ceri Richards are preparatory drawings for a series of lithographs he made to accompany poems by his friend Roberto Senesi, the Italian poet and translator. They had come to know each other because Senesi was the principal translator into Italian of the poetry of Dylan Thomas and of Vernon Watkins. The volume of poems was called Journey Towards the North, and they are meditations on art, poetry and life. They are, in a way, poems that deal with the interrelations between what we experience in the world and the creative transformations artists make of that experience. So all of these drawings, in a way, have personal elements to them, hidden in them, one might say, but all of them are to do with these themes which preoccupied Senesi and also, of course, Ceri Richards. One of these drawings is the study for the lithograph which he made by drawing onto a plate brought to his house by Stanley Jones, who was the chief lithographer for Kerwin Studios, probably the greatest lithographic technician of his time in England. It's called Vaucluse, and it refers to the well at Vaucluse in Provence, where Petrarch wrote the sonnets to Laura, his most famous love poems. So therefore we're dealing with a poet in nature and dealing with the natural theme in relation to human love. It's a poem by somebody about another poet, and this is a drawing done by somebody who reflects upon poetry, who is a lover of poetry, and who is himself preoccupied with the relationship of life and art. It's the most extraordinarily moving image. It's the last image that Richards ever made, because in fact he died of a heart attack the following day. What we have is a picture of his own hands drawing water. And it makes me think inevitably of another poet, John Keats, whose words written for his own gravestone were, "Here lies one whose name was writ in water." Itself a very poignant reflection upon his own belief that his fate was to be forgotten. Richards was himself deeply depressed during these days, and I can't help feeling that this drawing is a kind of reflection on that, a reflection upon transience, upon the inevitability of the eclipse of human hopes, artists' hopes, and so on. The sequence of drawings and of prints that were made from them also makes me think of a sequence much loved by Richards, who loved music as well as poetry, Winterreise by Schubert. The name of the sequence of poems by Senesi, Journey Towards the North, in some ways almost echoes that title, The Winter Journey, that inspired those fantastic songs by Schubert. This drawing and the print that comes from it is called Elegy for Vernon Watkins. Vernon Watkins has written a marvellous poem called Music of Colours, White Blossom. The idea that music might have an equivalence or find a correspondence in colour was an idea very close to Richard's heart, and which related him to the whole movement in early 20th century art that centred on these correspondences of one art form to another art form, of one kind of experience to another kind of experience. Vernon Watkins lived on the cliffs of Gower, and in those paintings, very grand paintings, we see petals, white flowers, petals, falling down in front of the cliffs that they both knew and where they had spent a great deal of time together. So here again, picking up on Senesi's poem in that volume, which is an elegy for Vernon Watkins, we have an artist looking at it and finding an image which absolutely concentrates a memory, an idea, a thought, if you like, about life and life's transience, because Watkins had died a few years before, in fact only in his 60s. A single image distilled from all that experience in one beautiful drawing. And it has, for me, a rather special feeling. It is as if Richards wants to put a kind of frame around that experience. And the frame is one of a deep blue, which recalls the sea, recalls all poets and all artists know that blue is the colour of infinity. Richards was not interested in illustrating the poems. He was interested in finding an image that would itself encapsulate the mood and feeling of the poetry. He was interested in evocation, in the capturing of a memory and a feeling. The drawings here are particularly rich, I think, and marvellous in colour and extraordinarily definite. So that they are from sketches which clearly are as near as Richards could get before he set to work on the plates to make the original prints of the portfolio. Basically, they are an artist at work, an artist being discovered at work, an artist near the end of his life, finding images to express complex and deep thoughts and feelings. Journey towards the North.
Well, I hope you found that an enlightening exploration of this fantastic last work in Ceri Richards' life. What we didn't see in that film was the portfolio of prints, which I've got here in front of me. And I thought it'd be nice to have a look through and see how the final prints match up with some of these beautiful preparatory paintings. This is how much of the print work that we buy at the gallery comes to us. We buy in full portfolios so that we know the provenance, the authenticity of the piece. And you get these lovely published boxes and cases as well. So here we are, Journey Toward the North, in Italian, in Roberto Sanesi's native language. It's that first image in the suite and that last image that Ceri Richards ever produced that we saw in Mel Gooding's piece. And you can see how closely, immediately, it matches up with this preparatory sketch over here. This beautiful moment on the transience of art and life, and a sort of a wondering on the legacy that Ceri Richards was to leave behind him. It was interesting to hear Mel Gooding talking about Schubert's Winterreise and the connections between that piece of music and this suite. Through a sort of a poetic, poignant poetic correspondence, Schubert also didn't get to see Winterreise published. He died while making his final amendments to the score, much as Richards died before he ever saw this portfolio produced. But the prints were finished and we can see them here today. So here's another corresponding with this image behind me here. There's a beautiful variation in the colours in the prints and the sort of the textures of the lithographic crayon. This is an image which we don't have a preparatory sketch for here, with Hermes attending Zeus, I think, here. Sanesi, the poet who supplied the text of this suite, he and Ceri Richards met first at Vernon Watkins' house in 1958 on the Gower Peninsula, and they used to wander along the cliff tops, retracing the steps of the dead poet Dylan Thomas. Here's that beautiful image up here. You can see how closely these preparatory paintings match the prints. And as you'll see in just a minute when we go through some of the even earlier sketches for this suite, how the same images seem to have recurred again and again, the same meanings, the same instances in the poetry which seem to have stuck with Ceri Richards and become these sort of final visions that stayed with him in these last months of his life. I love the difference between this print here, Elegy for Vernon Watkins, and the original painting. It's amazing how much that changing colour changes the feel of the print, but also how this beautiful sort of silver surface that you get in here is picked up on in the ink in here. I'd like to show you now, even earlier than these last preparatory paintings, we have here one of Ceri Richards' sketchbooks. And what's special about this is the sketches we'll find in here pertain directly to this suite. And you can see immediately as I open it up, this hand with these intertwining fingers, this face, matches this painting up here. And here you see maybe the first drafts, the first thoughts that went into that beautiful final image in Vaucluse. Here with the sort of the petals almost emanating from this pencil, almost like a sort of like a spell. And then closer to that final image. I think it's fascinating to see images as closely related as this, just to see the workings of an artist's mind really right in front of you in your hands. And I think as a final suite of images, as a final statement, really, these remain among the most important in Ceri Richards' career. It's a beautiful meditation on really what it is to be an artist and what art and all art forms are about those sort of secret hidden meanings that are unearthed, discovered, laid bare and then buried again in the process of making art, of writing poetry, composing music. I think it's a really touching, moving series of images, and fantastic to be able to see them from their germination here in sketch form to these beautiful, complete studies, and then the final portfolio. This is something rather exciting that's just come in. Having just looked at the last works of Ceri Richards, we've got another last great masterpiece that's come in. This is L'Ordre des Oiseaux. It's some of the last printed works by Georges Braque, one of the most important modern artists of the 20th century. I've done a little bit of research on these. We've done a little write-up on them, but I've never actually seen them in the flesh. So you are seeing these at the same time as I am in this fantastic portfolio. Birds were hugely important to Braque, particularly in his later life, as sort of symbols of spiritual and physical freedom, of liberation. He recalled going to the Camargue, which is an area in the south of France, very rich in sort of untouched wildlife, and seeing the birds flying up from the marshes there, inspiring a lot of his later work. You can see his signature down here. This was a suite produced in 1962. It was supposed to be a commemorative portfolio marking Braque's 80th birthday, and it had a text from St. John Perse, who was the pseudonym of a French writer, an ex-diplomat, who a couple of years earlier had won the Nobel Prize for Literature for his poetry, and who particularly liked Braque's work. So you've got their signatures here on this title page. But the real success of these prints was down to a Belgian master etcher called Aldo Crommelink. Crommelink was really the first person to convince Braque of the variety in etching. So these are etchings with acquatint. And he convinced Braque that an etching need not rely simply on black and white line, but that you could assert form and colour with great sort of vitality and expression. Crommelink had worked quite early in his career. He was a very, very gifted young printer, and he'd worked with the likes of Matisse and Leger in interpreting their etchings. And he started working with Braque in 1955, and over the period of sort of 6 or 7 years, they developed a very close working relationship. So really, the standout in this suite is these beautiful blocks of colour, a far cry from the sort of the dark hatched blacks and sepias that you think of when you think of etching, and that's really down to Crommelink's expertise. Braque was a very patient collaborator, and he was open to Crommelink suggesting processes, different ways of achieving certain effects. And it was really down then to Braque to make decisions to reject or accept his suggestions. So the two made a very sort of a very sensitive working pair. These beautiful sort of almost abstract, almost like the sort of Matisse cutouts. These very strong forms are typical of these late birds at Braque's. They've got that beautiful sort of swooping curvature to them. At this point, this was really the last months of Braque's life. He was an incredibly important painter and printmaker. He took to prints really in the latter half of his career after the war. Most people know him as a cubist from the sort of the pre-war years. Who with Picasso made those sort of beautiful, muted, earthy, early cubist paintings. So these late works might come as some surprise to those who know those early paintings. But really, at this point in his career, Braque was fatigued. He was ailing. He was nearing the end of his life. And in the subject of the bird, in the kind of the abstraction of it, as this sort of symbol of freedom and flight, and in these beautiful colours that Crommelink helped him to achieve, you get this sort of last great swan song in printmaking. This is one of my favourites in the series. This is the first time I've seen it in the flesh, and all these different textures that have been achieved by through the use of aquatint. This is almost like it's been painted. It's got beautiful sort of pock-marking textures like brushwork, that lovely sort of gritty, tactile quality that you get in aquatint. Lovely to be able to see these in the flesh. Look at that colour. And this, I think, is the last image in the suite. A series of 12 etchings. L'Ordre des Oiseaux by Georges Braque. Well, a change in the weather has put a slight change in our plans today for our pot section of this broadcast. We were going to be showing you some kitchen pots from around the gallery, but as we don't want to be running in and out of the rain, instead we're going to have a look at this awesome giant ongi pot by Kang-hyo. The samul nori is a kind of percussive Korean drum music. It finds its origins in sort of ritual musical celebrations of the harvest, of the yields for farmers in villages. And it's the music that Kang-hyo makes and decorates these pots to. The tremendous sort of dynamism, the action, the crescendoing of this music, the cymbals crashing, these different drums beating, matches this sort of tumultuous surface on this huge ongi pot. Ongi, like the samul nori, have their origins back in a sort of traditional way of life and of keeping food. They were originally made for storing kimchi, fermented foods, bean paste and soy, that sort of thing. But with the rise of refrigerators in many Koreans' homes, the number of people who can actually make ongi pots and who have them is becoming scarcer and scarcer. So Kang-hyo is one of a a very small number of people, able to make pots as big as this. They start from a base and they're built up in coils, sort of ropes of clay, that are pinched and paddled while Kang-hyo kicks the wheel with his foot. It's an incredibly labour-intensive process. 30 years of working like this has put tremendous strains on his body, and he now has to wear a brace when he's throwing a pot like this. But while that kind of calm, meditative procedure is necessary for throwing, for building up the walls of this enormous pot, in the decorating it's the complete opposite. With the samul nori beating in the background, Kang-hyo absolutely unleashes his sort of creative force on the pot with his slips, throwing them with ladles, spattering them with his hands and fingers, scratching through with his hands, his arms, with coarse brushes. You can see the variety of textures across this surface. We're going to leave you today with a 6 or 7 minute clip of Kang-hyo decorating one of these pots. When we first saw this, when our film team went out and filmed Kang-hyo, this was one of the most extraordinary things that we've ever captured on camera. And our Kang-hyo film remains one of our most watched today. If you've not seen this clip before, I think this is going to blow your mind. And if you have seen it before, I hope you enjoy it again.
to educate, entertain our customers.
Okay, so now we're going to look at some other of his prints.
Thinking very seriously about stopping making pots.
There's nothing forced, and I think his jogs are really the epitome of that.
Hello, welcome to today's broadcast from the Goldmark Gallery.
One of my most regular places to visit up in this part of the world is the Goldmark Gallery.